the Toronto Star. I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. If you're a person of color, racism and its effects is something you carry under your skin. But when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, what goes through your mind? War zones, violence, something devastating that sweeps through someone's life. But how many of us think of the office as a place that can give you PTSD? As a marginalized person, it is possible to get workplace PTSD through day-to-day interactions and microaggressions, all of which lead to so much fear, anxiety, and self-doubt, and general job insecurity, working in environments dominated by mostly white bosses. It's not often as easy as just complaining to a supervisor, and you can carry the weight of it from job to job, whether or not the threat is real. Dr. Monnica Williams joins me today to talk about workplace PTSD and how, if you're a racialized professional, it can affect your career and your life. Dr. Monnica Williams is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa's Psychology Department, and she has extensively studied the impact of racial trauma on people of color. Hello, Dr. Williams. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great to be here today.
So, Dr. Williams, it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it, when we're talking about organizations claiming to move forward and benefit from a diverse, multicultural, and inclusive workforce, while we do see the counterforce of racism often undermines that effort, right?
Oh, absolutely. So many people of color encounter racism in the workforce, and sometimes it's so bad that they actually can't continue. They leave, they find another job, they feel traumatized, and it really makes it hard for people of color to succeed sometimes.
Right. And I want to go to the very foundations of this. What is race-based stress and trauma? Does this kind of thing lead to PTSD? What are the symptoms?
Yes. So many people of color experience small forms of racism fairly regularly in a form we sometimes describe as microaggressions or everyday discrimination. And these can add up. It's almost like when people talk about death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? The first time someone punches you in the arm, it's going to hurt a little bit. But if lots of people keep punching you in the arm, eventually it's going to be really tender and sore. And then at some point, it's just not going to heal. And that's what so many people of color are experiencing regularly. Lots and lots of small assaults on their character, their worthiness, their personality characteristics, their heritage. And then on top of that, sometimes you get a major discriminatory event. And so all of that together can lead to traumatization. And yes, the symptoms can look just like post-traumatic stress disorder.
Very well put, Dr. Williams, about the analogy of death by 1,000 cuts. It just keeps building up. So in this context, is there such an issue as workplace PTSD? What does that look like? And in your experience, how does racism most commonly manifest itself at the workplace in particular? You already talked about microaggressions.
Yes. Unfortunately, I have seen many, many people of color who were traumatized by workplace discrimination. And it can take on so many different forms, but it seems like the very worst of it is when a person's direct supervisor behaves in a continually discriminatory, belittling, abusive way. And that can make people feel so disillusioned and afraid and worried that they feel stressed just driving into the office in the morning. Already they may feel a churning in their stomach. They may feel sweaty. They may feel anxious. And then it just gets worse from there because they never know when that person that they're working with is going to drop a small or large comment or undermine their credibility or effectiveness on the job. And so many people get a real sense of worth and value from their careers, and they take pride in the work they do. And so to have that continually undermined by a person in a superior position is very, very damaging.
Right. So this is, in a way, an example of an overt kind of microaggression or discrimination. But these microaggressions, they can be indirect, subtle, or even unintentional. And there might be other acts of discrimination like stereotyping and avoidance. Can you speak to a little bit of that?
Sure. So microaggressions, by definition, they tend to be subtle. So someone might intend to give someone a compliment, but what it really turns into is a backhanded compliment. So they might say something like, Jenny, your presentation was so good today. You are so articulate. They may mean that as a compliment, but to kind of pointedly say, oh, you're so articulate, in a way that might imply that they didn't expect that from the person, that can be hurtful. And I know as a Black woman, I get this comment a lot. And I always find it quite interesting because I am a university professor, so I hope I'm articulate. And I don't know why someone would not expect me to be articulate, but I don't see my white male colleagues getting that particular comment or that particular compliment. So that's one example. Another example that happens frequently to Black women is that if they're wearing their hair in a natural style, white women feel like they can just come up and touch your hair and say, oh, can I touch that? And often they're asking as they're reaching for your hair. And that's a real violation of personal space. To have someone just feel like they can pet you like, a poodle is really insulting. And it's also a very intimate act. You don't just touch people's heads unless, maybe it's your child or your significant other. And so this can feel really demeaning.
Yes, I can speak to that and relate to that myself in terms of I've been asked many times about how my English is so good, which is ironic considering that I'm in broadcasting. So how common is this, do you think, for BIPOC professionals, and why? It seems like almost everybody has a story similar to this and experiences similar to this.
Yeah, well, the short answer is that it's caused by racism. But I can break that down a bit for you in that because people tend to have stereotypes, false stereotypes about people from different racial or ethnic groups, those stereotypes play out in how they treat those people. And so that's what you're seeing in terms of the expression of these microaggressions. They're often ways that people have learned, maybe through just living in society. One of the things that racism does is it kind of teaches us false things about people in other racial and ethnic groups. And so when you're operating with a lot of bad information, you end up saying inappropriate things and making bad decisions about other people because you think you know about them when you don't.
And is racial trauma and PTSD in that context widely recognized as a legitimate disorder, a problem? How is it received if someone says they might have developed PTSD at work? I'm asking this because it's such a challenge to talk about and give legitimacy to mental health issues in our social setup as it is, right?
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate. There was a research study done a few years ago looking at American counselors, asking them, how often do you see people with race-based trauma? And 70% of them had seen clients with this, but when asked how many of you have received training on how to assess or treat it, very few of them had. And so this doesn't bode well for us. So basically what it means is that a lot of people are going to therapy with this stress and even trauma, but very few clinicians actually have the training and knowledge to treat it. So this is a big problem. And I think that part of it is because, yes, we tend, when we think about PTSD, we're thinking about people who've been in combat or who've been raped or who've been robbed or who've been in a car accident. And we're not thinking about all these people who have been subjected to racism on a chronic basis.
And as the data shows, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are still hugely underrepresented in senior roles at work. So how does that affect the mindset of professionals trying to call out and address racism and discrimination, often within their own workplaces? And are there instances where they would feel gaslighted in a way?
Oh, absolutely. So often when Black and Indigenous and other stigmatized groups are mistreated in the workplace, supervisors, particularly white supervisors, tend to minimize the impact and what's happened, and they are reluctant to call out perpetrators or discipline other people who've acted in these ways. And so that makes people of color feel disenfranchised and sometimes helpless in the face of these continued experiences. And I think that there's a very unspoken, strong white solidarity that prevents white people from calling out other white people. And that's kind of what we need to happen if this is going to change. But because this unspoken solidarity is so strong, it's hard to break. And that's why it's hard to bring about change.
We'll be right back. I really want to draw a picture for our listeners, like what it would look like for a racialized professional in a work organization to go through something like this. Have you come across people of color who suffer from trauma as a result of ongoing mistreatment in the workplace? Any examples that you can provide that kind of speak to that during your research?
Oh, many, many examples. Unfortunately, I mean, people that I'm assessing and treating now for this. And it's really quite sad. People who've been subjected to this, they feel a loss of self-esteem. They feel depressed. They feel anxious. They worry about the future. They don't want to leave their house. They don't want to connect with others and socialize. They feel shame over what's happened to them because they somehow believe it's because of something they did or they weren't strong enough. And sometimes people even become suicidal. I've worked with people that were IT professionals, people with PhDs who have looked disheveled and disoriented as a result of ongoing harassment and discrimination at work. Even one university professor who lost his job due to workplace discrimination and harassment, and he ended up homeless. So sometimes you wouldn't even recognize people who've been abused in this way as the fully functioning professionals that they used to be or that they could be, except for this horrible onslaught on their very sense of self.
And keeping this framework in mind, how major a factor is fear and job insecurity in all of this, where racialized people might feel like they can't speak out or the onslaught is going to continue no matter where they work? Do they carry that perception from job to job?
Oh, I mean, they definitely can. And I find it can be a lose-lose situation because if you are experiencing this and you feel angry, rightly so, and you try to bring about change, and yet the people around you aren't supportive of it, you just get very frustrated and you get kind of labeled as that angry troublemaker. And then other people who may respond more with fear and they don't speak out, they just continue to tolerate it. They're sort of accumulating this, they're taking in all of these toxins, and it eventually takes a toll on their health, and their mental well-being. And they may become even more and more fearful, especially if they see others who try to speak out being punished. So absolutely, they can carry the effects for a lifetime, sadly.
And you developed a tool for measuring anxiety-related trauma symptoms due to racial discrimination. Can you tell us more about that and what were your findings?
Yes. So because I found that it's so hard for therapists to know even how to ask the questions about racial discrimination, I developed an interview that guides therapists with the exact questions they need to ask people that they think may have racial trauma to determine if they have it, what caused it, what it looks like, how severe it is, and if it meets criteria for PTSD. And that's available in English and Spanish, and it's now available in French. And then I also have a self-report measure that people can complete called the Trauma Symptoms of Discrimination Scale. It's a checklist of different symptoms that they might be having as a result of dealing with discrimination.
Right. And when we talk about these issues and when we talk about somebody who's faced that kind of situation and dealt with the repercussions, sometimes there are questions about why didn't you complain to someone? Why didn't you voice your concerns? For someone who's from a racialized group dealing with workplace discrimination or microaggressions, is formally reporting incidents actually a viable option?
Well, first of all, for people from many cultures, it would be considered severe sign of disrespect to challenge or complain against a superior in any situation, and they're just not going to do it. But for many others who do try to report the problems or file a complaint, the outcomes are not usually very good. And in fact, they can end up being punished indirectly through the very act of making a complaint because other people will find out and retaliate against them. Unfortunately, most of these processes for reporting complaints are not even intended to help the people who complain, but they're really meant as a way of sort of protecting the organization so they can say, oh, see, we had something in place for these people, but you really have no idea how well that process works unless you look at the number of complaints and how well they are resolved, especially from the perspective of the person who filed the complaint. A lot of businesses just don't even keep that information because they just don't want to know, because the fact of the matter is it's really just an exercise so that they can say that they're doing something and try to prevent lawsuits against them.
And that takes on different connotations where women professionals are concerned as well, especially women of color. There's people that I've spoken to who didn't want to sound too aggressive or to be labeled as an angry woman. So there's that added pressure as well in terms of gender.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, women get mischaracterized for even just showing leadership, much less trying to rectify workplace problems. And so, yes, that's like a double whammy that you're dealing with in the workplace, if you are a woman of color.
And how important is it to create safe spaces for difficult conversations like these at the workplace? Is there anything that can be done?
Oh, absolutely. There are many different approaches that employers can take to improve the racial climate of their workplace. Certainly, safe, regular dialogues around issues of race and racism can be very important. Also, I think that, it's really important that there's very clear policies on what sorts of behaviors and comments are acceptable and what isn't acceptable, and that there's very swift response to anybody who violates those policies and makes people in the workplace feel unsafe or uncomfortable due to their race, ethnicity, or culture. And so employers need to be consistently checking in with their employees of color to make sure that the workplace is safe, because those employees may not feel safe reporting what's happening to them.
And what do you think about online resources or interactions for people who might not have a lot of resources? For example, what do you think about the self-care hashtags we see on social media and the role of Black Twitter, for instance, as a resource for people who may not have as much help to help process all of this?
Yeah, I think those are really invaluable because, all the support you can get, the better. So many people in the workplace, they end up feeling very confused, and sometimes they feel a bit like they're going insane if they're reporting problems and other people are saying, oh, I don't see it. So it can be very empowering, very centering and grounding to talk to others who are going through the same thing and to receive that support.
And do you think the discourse on this has been changing recently with this global racial reckoning we're seeing? We're seeing so many more stories come out, so many more people speaking out. Obviously, there's a lot more to be heard and said, but where do you see this heading?
Yeah, I love the way you put it, global racial reckoning.
Sounds epic.
I think it's going in the right direction. I'm always a little skeptical because honestly, whenever there's, some racial tragedy in the news, everybody's talking about it for like 3 days and then it disappears like it never happened. And this seems to be sustained, and it seems like people are listening, and it seems like some changes are happening. So I'm hopeful. Jury's still out as to whether or not this is going to translate into some of the permanent changes that we need, but I'm very hopeful.
Dr. Monnica Williams, you've been very insightful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been great being here.
Stay safe.
You too. Thank you.
That was Dr. Monnica Williams, an associate professor at the University of Ottawa, who's been researching the impact of racial trauma on people of color. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So-Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.